So, right off the top, I wanted to kind of offer a bit of context of why I invited you on and thought this would be a meaningful conversation. A few months ago, we did an episode with Dr. Russell Barkley about ADHD, and I wasn't too sure what the feedback would be. And to this day, that episode has been downloaded or viewed over 50,000 times. And I would look at the comments and I would look at the direct messages I would get about that one episode. And I was kind of shocked about the feedback, about how many people it resonated with. And one of the comments that kind of kept coming up on YouTube and on our socials was people wanting us to have a conversation about OCD and some of the correlation between young people struggling with ADHD having a trickle effect to OCD symptoms. So I have not suffered with OCD, but I think we all have friends that have, and I'm sure a lot of listeners are as well. So that's the context for today's conversation. And Greg, I really thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you inviting me on. I'm excited to be here. And I think this is such a huge topic, especially nowadays, especially with this current pandemic. And one thing that I'm really seeing, and one thing that I think is really important right off the bat, is to understand that we have a nervous system and we have this fight or flight system that kicks on anytime we're under stress. And anytime that we're in a stress response in that nervous system, we're basically in survival mode. So anytime we're in survival mode, it really creates what's called this default mode network in the brain, which is essentially like a safety mechanism, which tells you, okay, do what you've always done, believe what you've always believed, think what you've always thought, because it's kept you alive until now. So therefore, it's going to ensure your sense of safety and security. And I think anytime that we're triggering that stress response in the nervous system, what also happens is we perceive the outer environment as stressful as well. So with this current pandemic and everything that's going on in the world and on social media, everyone is trapped in this fight or flight response. So everyone is living their life essentially in survival mode, almost as if that lion or tiger is still chasing us when we were living out in nature. And to me, the source of and the root of a lot of this ADHD and OCD and a lot of that is collectively, as a culture, we have such dysregulated nervous systems. So that's just something that's been on my mind a lot recently. So I just wanted to share that right off the bat.
Maybe we should start a little bit wide and with your personal story. What led you down having these conversations, this line of work, and your own personal experience with OCD?
Yeah, so my experience with OCD started about 12 years ago, about 10 to 12 years ago. When I was a freshman in college, I was a Division I athlete at the University of Houston. And halfway through my freshman year, I experienced a physical trauma that caused me to have to go into surgery right away. It was very painful, very challenging. And as I came out of anesthesia, as I came out of the surgery, I started experiencing a lot of repetitive thoughts, a lot of looping thoughts, a lot of even like hallucinations, like I was seeing images and stuff. And there was this element of vulnerability that I experienced after experiencing that trauma, that I realized what happened was the OCD was almost like a protective mechanism. The OCD is very much like an addiction. Someone who struggles with OCD is very much addicted to certain thought patterns, addicted to certain behaviors, addicted to certain looping thoughts or any sort of ritual or routine, because during a time of vulnerability, those were the things that gave us a sense of safety. So for me, I started developing a lot of looping thought patterns. My mind would repeat things over and over. I'd constantly have to check things like check doors and this and that. And what I realized was those were essentially giving me, it's almost like an insurance policy. It was giving me a sense of safety and security. And the reason for that, the reason I needed that was I experienced a level of vulnerability that ran so deep with that trauma that my mind said, okay, we need to come up with a game plan to do whatever we can do to make sure we never re-experience that. And a lot of the patterns of thoughts, behaviors, checking this, doing that, thinking this, going there is really a way in which we try and bypass that vulnerability. It's like, let's never re-experience that again. So let's do everything we possibly can and create every situation and scenario we can to try and avoid any sort of re-experience of a trauma. So that's what I experienced for quite a number of years. And it was very painful, very challenging, very debilitating. And that's what really brought me on my own healing journey and into the work that I now do today.
It's very interesting that you said it was a specific moment. I guess for someone that isn't familiar, you would think this would happen at a young age and gradually be almost always a part of someone's life, not necessarily one moment that can spark it. That's very, very interesting. But for someone who's just listening right now, let's say they have a friend that says, hey, I'm struggling with OCD, and they're open and honest about that. How would you describe this? What is a simple definition of OCD? And for a friend or someone who's trying to support another person, what is it like to experience this day to day so they could kind of get a clear picture of what it's like?
An analogy that I like to use that just comes to mind, I actually don't know if I've ever used it, but it comes to mind, is OCD is kind of like a prison you create for yourself. And if you think about someone who's living in a prison cell, first of all, obviously they're imprisoned, but they're also safe. They're safe and protected from the outer world and the vulnerabilities of the world itself. So a lot of times OCD, we could say, is certain routines, rituals, thought patterns, behaviors that we use to imprison ourselves as a way of giving ourselves a sense of safety and security. So there's this kind of like, there's this paradox of I'm in pain because I don't feel free, I feel imprisoned, but I also feel safe at the same time. So it's kind of like this weird paradox of I'm not free, I'm in pain because I feel restricted and inside of this prison, but I also feel safe and protected at the same time. So it's kind of a weird paradox. And that's something I experience. But in reality, when it comes to the human experience, what we all crave the most is freedom. We want the freedom to do the things we want to do, to express ourselves the way we want to express ourselves, and to experience life with a sense of freedom. And anytime we're imprisoning ourselves for a sense of safety and security, it can become very painful and it creates a lot of suffering. So it can create a lot of wind up inside of you. So that's where it creates a lot of stress.
It sounds like there's a moment of tension, then compulsion, then you do the thing, and then it releases the tension. But unfortunately, you end up right back at that circle. And as you were sharing that, I kind of had the thought of, for example, in a typical sense, when I have a feeling to do something, whether it is before this episode, I wanted caffeine, and I had caffeine because I thought there would be a real world benefit. So I had the feeling, I was tired, had caffeine. I understood there's a real world benefit of maybe I won't stutter quite as much, I do enough, or I'll think a little bit more clearly because real world benefit. Or, hey, I'm going to have a glass of wine because I'm a bit anxious. There's a real world benefit. What sounds incredibly frustrating and tragic with the prison analogy is that there's almost no real world benefit to a lot of the compulsions. Does that make sense? And that's what makes it so really heartbreaking in many ways.
There's no real world benefit on an external level. The benefit the person gains is on an internal level of I feel safer. But obviously, like the glass of wine or the cup of coffee, like you engage the world in a different way. So you might be more energized, more focused, more relaxed, whatever it might be. So a lot of people see the benefit on the feedback they get from the outer world based on their state change. But something you alluded to that's really important is OCD, the prerequisite to that is there's some sort of internal wind up. There's something that winds the system up, and then the OCD is kind of like the release valve. So it's kind of like if you shake a soda bottle up, eventually you pull the cap off and it releases. OCD energetically, it's almost like a bottlenecking of energy that then needs to be released. So the work and the healing work to be done is, okay, what's creating that windup? What's causing that need to have a release valve? It might be trying to bypass certain unresolved emotions. It could be simply mismanagement of your diet and lifestyle that's creating stress in the system, that's creating a windup that, for example, like the mismanagement of blood sugar, huge stress response in the body that can create a windup and the need for a release valve. So that's the real work, is determining why do we need the release valve and what's causing the windup in the first place.
Does this tension cycle, almost like an addiction, continue to get shorter and shorter? Meaning tension release is a gap, but once you do that, it'll get shorter and shorter and more intense. For someone suffering, do they find that circle gets more and more aggressive and much quicker, and there's more need for tension releases?
I think there's more need for tension releases the longer you go without addressing the root cause of it. And, there's some sort of choice, behavior, belief system that's creating that tension in the first place. So, there's the law of facilitation of the more and more you facilitate a certain path, the easier it is to really go down that path more and more again in the future. So the more and more you facilitate certain belief systems, certain choices, certain behaviors, and that creates the windup, and then there's the release valve as a result of the windup. The more and more you facilitate that pattern, the easier and easier it is for it to repeat itself. So that's where, if you do the work and you say, okay, what's the behavior, the choice, and the belief system that's creating the windup? Okay, that's where we need to start. We need to explore what's contributing to that, and then start questioning our belief systems, start reframing our belief systems. Then we can start changing our choices, change our behaviors, and then now we're in a more balanced state and we don't need that release valve anymore. So it's really tracking it back to its origin, which is usually some sort of belief system, which you go far enough back, it's usually a childhood belief system.
Going back to why it's so important to address the root cause, and I guess the conversation of momentum in your life both ways. One of the things that I was super surprised about, kind of my aha moment with the ADHD episode, was that Dr. Barkley said it'll start with ADHD in your teens, but that leads to anxiety. And then another cycle of momentum leads to depression. So while ADHD may start, it'll lead to multiple other issues. So do you find somebody that has OCD, it's not just, hey, I have OCD, it's now I'm anxious, now I'm depressed, and it leads to almost like negative momentum with other concerns?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of these patterns go together, the anxiety, the OCD, the depression, a lot of whatever labels we want to create or we want to use. A lot of the root causes are actually the same root causes, no matter how it manifests on the surface level, whether it's ADHD, OCD, anxiety. And for me, like anxiety and depression often go together. I kind of see anxiety and depression as two sides of the same coin. And anxiety would kind of be like heads and depression would be tails, where anxiety is kind of like the masculine outward energy and depression is kind of like the feminine inward energy. And a lot of times people start with anxiety and they burn themselves out enough energetically where then they retreat inward and it becomes depression. So that's one element in how they interact together. But the ADHD and the OCD, what comes up a lot is there's a lot of similarities in the sense that what we're seeing is there's a perceived lack of safety. And a lot of times, for example, ADHD, as a child, a lot of times we feel unsafe in our environments. Maybe we had abusive parents, or we had a lot of conflict in the household, or there wasn't enough food on the table, or whatever it is, we didn't really feel safe in our environments. So our perception of the outer world is that of unsafety. So the ADHD and the inability to focus a lot of times is us trying to micromanage our outer environment, and to stay focused on one thing, you might miss out on the threat of a couple of other things in your environment. So a lot of times the ADHD is this micromanaging of your environment that you don't feel safe in. And the OCD, there's also a lack of perceived safety. So we create routines and rituals and behaviors and thought patterns as a way of creating a prison of safety that we can reside within. So there's a lot of similarities and carryovers in terms of all of these, mental health challenges, but the root cause of them are a lot really the same.
You mentioned that your personal experience with OCD was sparked by a traumatic moment. Is that something you hear a lot in your work and the people that you're helping right now, that it was in fact one distinct moment that they noticed created this? Or in some cases, did these moments build at a young age? Or is it pretty universal that you hear that one moment can really spark this?
I've had a lot of cases where it has been one moment that has triggered a lot of it. And I've also had a lot of cases where it's not necessarily one moment, but it's more of a childhood programming, where when a child gets programmed in a certain way, remember, for the first 7 years of a child's life, they're just downloading information. They're kind of like a sponge that's just absorbing everything from the outer environments. They don't have any filtration system yet. So that first 7 years of their life really creates the foundation of their inner programs and their belief systems. And that is the foundation of a lot of these challenges. For example, I've had a lot of clients that have come to me with patterns of OCD. And when I track it back to the root cause, a lot of it is religious programming. For example, I've worked with a lot of men who were brought up in very strict Catholic homes. And the Catholic Church has a lot of teachings around sexuality that really aren't all that healthy for a young child, right? No masturbation, don't touch your genitals, or, pornography or exploring this. These are all sins. So all of a sudden that creates a response of shame inside of the child that feels, oh, I feel a natural instinct to explore these things, but I was told, I was programmed that that's not okay. So I start suppressing my urges, suppressing my thoughts about girls, or thoughts about, masturbation, or urges to do this, behaviors to do that. And a lot of that shame creates a lot of wind-up, and all of a sudden the mind starts repeating things, and we start getting addicted to certain things. So a lot of these, whether it's religious programs or just any sort of programming that starts at a really early age, that creates some sort of stress response, some sort of guilt or shame inside of the child, that creates a lot of these patterns like OCD. And I've seen it a lot. So it's not always one specific event. A lot of times it's actually kind of seeds that have been planted in the psyche of a child that start to grow and germinate. And all of a sudden that creates a lot of almost division and separation and polarization inside of the child. And they start having things like OCD and anxiety, and, thinking that, this thought is okay and this thought's not okay. So I'm going to try and suppress this thought. And all of a sudden that thought starts looping and repeating, because remember, what you resist persists. So you can see how these patterns start to become generated when there's, a lot of unhealthy programs being instilled in a child.
Shifting to your healing process and how you work with others, I guess what I'm predicting would differ in this conversation and some others was when we talk about ADHD, anxiety, and depression, pharmaceuticals will come up, or supplementation will come up as medication. Is there a pharmaceutical that is used for OCD? Is there supplementation or diet that you work on? What starts your healing process logistically and through real world examples?
So for me, I'm not against any pharmaceuticals. I'm not against any supplements. I think there's a time and a place for all of it. But for me, what I've experienced is it's usually SSRIs that are used across the board for OCD, similar to obviously depression and anxiety, things like that. But for me, I always look at the basics first. I always dial in simplicity before going to complexity. That's something that I think our culture gets backwards, is we have this addiction to complexity, and we have this illusion that, okay, I have a complex issue, therefore it needs a complex solution. And that's actually an illusion. A lot of times complex issues can be solved by dialing in the basics, getting your foundational lifestyle principles dialed in, and really the power of simplicity. So I've had a lot of cases where, we clean up the diet, we get someone eating organic food, we get them getting to bed on time and living with their circadian cycles and the rising and setting of the sun. We get them moving properly, not overly exercising, not just working out, but doing restorative movement like Tai Chi and Qigong and stretching and mobilizing and some gentle yoga, something that's more restorative that balances the nervous system. I always look at my clients' breathing patterns. One thing I notice is most people nowadays have a faulty breathing pattern. Their chest breathing, their mouth breathing, which triggers a fight or flight response in the nervous system, then sends a signal to the brain, hey, you're not safe, you need to fight or flight. And all of a sudden there's anxiety and ADD and OCD, when in reality, your nervous system was just responding to your breath. So for me, getting someone to breathe diaphragmatically and really slowing and deepening their breath to balance the nervous system, that goes a long way. So I always try and dial in the basics first. And that usually gets people at least, 60, 70% of the way, a simple meditation practice, simple tools like journaling and tapping, EFT I love. So all of these foundational principles and the low-hanging fruit I like to go after first before diving into any, unresolved trauma or, unresolved relationship wounds or childhood programming. I always like to go simplicity before complexity. And then whatever's left over after we've dialed in the basics, then we go into some of the deeper challenges. Whether it's, going into our archetypes, our, core addictions and some of the, work with the inner child and, a lot of the old, leftover wounds from our earlier years. So I always try and go, basic principles first, get a solid foundation. Because if you try and do a lot of the deeper work without getting the foundational principles, it usually doesn't last very long. And it's usually just temporary because, you can address childhood wounds all you want, but if someone's not managing their blood sugar, they're not sleeping well, if they're not moving well and breathing well and spending time out in nature, you're never really going to get very far.
You hear in people that are in an AA program use the term that you're always an addict. Even if you're 20 years sober, you are an addict, and that doesn't go away. When talking about healing from OCD, is there a moment yourself or in your clients where they say, I'm cured? Or is it always a maintenance process that once you've struggled with this, you will be working on maintenance for the rest of your life?
I like to see it a little differently. Something that really gets people trapped with things like OCD and anxiety is we're kind of this mindset of like OCD or anxiety or back pain or digestive issues, whatever it is. These are problems for us to get rid of. And the act of trying to get rid of something or trying to push something away is actually what keeps you entangled in it. So a lot of times, I experienced this in myself in my own journey, that what kept me so in the OCD was my constant desire to push it away and get rid of it. Where, one of the biggest healing steps for me and one of the biggest breakthroughs I've had with myself and my clients is to not push it away, but to welcome it in and actually see it as a teacher. And for me, my OCD has been one of the greatest spiritual teachers that I've ever had. And it's not a teacher that you really want or would wish for, but it's taught me so much. And it's the only way I can share with you and your listeners on the podcast today is because I've had authentic experience with it. So for me, it's less of something to get rid of and more something to learn from. And for me, the OCD or the anxiety or the back pain or the digestive issues is almost like your body and your mind's feedback mechanism that's mirroring back to you the way you're managing yourself, your body, your mind, your emotions. And it's showing you where there's still healing that's needed to be done. And when you do some of the deeper healing work, what happens is the OCD is no longer something that you have to get rid of. And it becomes more of a teacher and a mentor than an enemy. And the reason people get so entangled with their OCD is they're trying to push it away. And remember, whatever you push pushes back. And it's kind of like people talk about OCD and intrusive thoughts. A lot of people say, oh, I have a lot of intrusive thoughts. Well, what makes a thought intrusive? If you think about, when you're in your home, an intruder is someone who's not wanted. So if you say, okay, well, the only reason my obsessive compulsive thoughts and intrusive thoughts are intrusive is because there's a part of my ego that's not wanting them, that's trying to keep them out, trying to push them away. What if I actually welcome them in like a guest coming in to have some tea with me? And say, okay, are you here to teach me something? And you engage it. And all of a sudden, as you welcome it in, what happens is it starts to dissolve and you start to get the message. A lot of times the OCD is actually a messenger that keeps knocking on the door trying to get your attention because you're here to learn and to grow. That's what we as souls are here to do. And if we're refusing the door, we're refusing, the call or the message, the knock's just going to get louder. It's kind of like the hero's journey. There's the call to adventure, then there's the refusal of the call and the intervention. A lot of times the OCD or the anxiety is the intervention, saying it's time to answer the call. And once you welcome these challenges in and you sit with them and you learn from them and you be fully present with them, then they've served their purpose and they are no longer needed. But sometimes they hang around, and a lot of times they hang around as a way of, giving you feedback as to how you're managing yourself. For example, if someone has anxiety or OCD and, they did a lot of healing work and they resolved it, but all of a sudden they start partying too much, or they're not sleeping well, and they're not eating well, and they're not exercising, and they're in financial stress, and whatever it might be, they're mismanaging relationship stress. All of a sudden the OCD comes back, but in reality, you threw your nervous system out of balance. And everyone kind of has their Achilles heel. Everyone has their, something that shows up. For some people, when they're under stress, they have gut issues. For some people under stress, they have OCD or anxiety. Some people under stress, they throw their back out. It's different for everybody, but in reality, those are symptoms showing you where you're mismanaging yourself. And it's an awareness to bring yourself back into balance.
That was beautifully put. Forgive me if this is a super kind of left field question, and also if it can be easily debunked, but leading up to this conversation, my producer sent me a few anecdotal Reddit forums and people talking about what potentially sparked their OCD. And something that I was reading a lot about is negative or traumatic psychedelic experiences causing a spark for certain people, at least online, claiming that's what led to their first symptoms of OCD. Is this something you hear of? Is it a concern of yours, or is it easily debunked as a forum conversation?
No, it happens all the time.
Wow.
And one of my mentors, he works with a lot of cases of not just OCD, but schizophrenia and multiple personality disorders and all kinds of stuff when there's the mismanagement of psychedelics. And I'm all for the use of psychedelics. I mean, I've used plant medicine ceremonies a lot in my life as part of my healing. It was part of my healing journey, but it was always done with, set and setting, the right intention, a lot of the integration work and the preparation work. So if you get someone that, goes into the jungle and does, ayahuasca or DMT or psilocybin with no prep work, no background of meditation or spiritual development, and you completely dismantle the ego and you completely expose yourself to the collective unconscious, and you dissolve your sense of self as a separate, individual self, that can open the door to a lot of challenges. And a lot of times what happens is you start creating this separation between you and the thinking mind, you and the ego sense of self, your separate self. And a lot of times what happens is it creates this fear response of like, okay, who is this I and who is this, ego self? Who is this, separate self I'm in relationship with? It creates a lot of confusion of like, wait, who am I really? And, that can be very beautiful because it can be a spiritual awakening. And a lot of the spiritual awakening, if it's mismanaged, can actually create a lot of pathology because there's an inability to really know how to integrate those experiences. And there's also, the element of maybe that person wasn't ready for that deep of an experience of union. Remember, for someone to have a real union experience, we all say all is one. Well, what does that really mean? It doesn't mean we're all one, yes. But if we dissolve the illusion of separation too fast, remember, if all is one and you have a union experience, you have to allow your individual self to die completely. Like there's no more you anymore. There's just the greater whole. So if someone's not ready for that kind of, experience of disillusion and dissolving, that can create a lot of fear and a lot of the challenges we're talking about. So that's very real. And people have to be very careful with the use of psychedelics. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people who have healed from things like OCD with psychedelics. So, there's a light and a shadow side to it, but it's really being in right relationship with it.
It's really interesting, and it's something that I grapple with a lot. There's so much excitement right now, especially in North America, with research and certain conversations around legalization of psychedelics and helping people with depression and anxiety. And there seems like there's a lot of positivity and beautiful conversations over the next few years that are going to help millions of people. But there is that asterisk that potentially maybe not enough people are having the conversation, that some people may not be ready. Maybe people are going into it at the wrong time. Is that something you grapple with as well, that there's such incredible upside and so much excitement and momentum that you don't want to slow down the momentum now that it's here, but there's also some fear that the momentum could reverse and public opinion can shift if there are these moments, enough of these negative or traumatic moments for people? Is that a concern of yours at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm concerned and excited at the same time. I'm excited that, these psychedelics, which are really medicines, these plant medicines, are really coming to the forefront in terms of their effectiveness. And to me, those deep mystical experiences that you can have with the psychedelics are incredibly powerful. And there's a reason that, I think they're woven into nature and we've been using them for thousands and thousands of years. So I'm very excited that that stuff's coming up and being utilized in the mainstream. My concern is that it's going to be misused and it's going to lose its sacredness. That's something that I feel like, in terms of my concerns, is probably at the forefront. Is a lot of times when we take something that's new and novel and then we try and make it mainstream, we lose the sacredness of it. We've lost, if we just look at, health at large and industry at large, we've lost the sacredness of food. People don't know where their food comes from. People are completely disconnected from their food. They think, putting food in the body is like putting gasoline in your car, is just to, give you energy to keep going. But so we've lost the sacredness of food. And I'm afraid that we're going to lose the sacredness of these plants. And I think when you lose the sacredness, that's when you start mismanaging. And for me, the way these plants have been used indigenously and for, millennia was in real ceremony and real reverence to the earth. And I think we're too much in a kind of like a consumerist society where we think the earth and Mother Nature is just there for us to consume and consume and consume. But if we don't put anything back and we don't honor the sacredness of the consumption of these things, that's where we can really get into trouble. So that's probably my number one concern, is it becoming like too clinical and less sacred. That's a big thing for me.
It's very interesting. It's rare when you have moments where you're very excited and you want to fully support positive momentum for something, but there are also concerns and there needs to be balanced conversation, which we might slightly be lacking right now online. So I'm glad we brought it up briefly. So wrapping up, if someone's listening right now and they are suffering with OCD, what is the simplest or most important foundational piece of advice you could give? Doesn't matter how simple. If someone's watching this and made it to the end, what is something that they should try to implement that is easy and that can make a measurable impact to create some positive momentum in their suffering?
So two things come to mind that I'll share is, number one, to remember why your mind behaves the way it does and what the purpose of your mind really is. And the purpose of our mind is really to ensure a sense of survival. That's its number one focus, is survival. So to understand that, we have to take a look at, okay, well, in order for me to survive, do I have to be aware of the positive things or the negative things? Well, we have to be aware of the negative things because the negative things are a threat to our survival, not the positive things. So that's why our mind is very focused on a lot of the negative a lot of the time, is because it's really trying to protect us. It's really looking out for our safety, security, and survival. So I actually like to almost think about your mind as like a watchdog. And if you think about like you just adopted a dog and you bring it home and it's like looking out the window of your house and surveying your property, and anytime that someone walks by or the mailman comes or there's another dog, it starts barking. And your mind works in the same way. It's perceiving your internal and external environments. And the thoughts that keep looping and repeating and the negative thoughts and all of that are really just your mental watchdog just barking as a way of trying to protect you. So the first step that I always work with myself and my clients with is, okay, give your little mental watchdog a name. Let's say Buddy. And anytime your mind starts repeating or looping or doing this or doing that, first of all, just acknowledge it and say, thanks, Buddy. Thanks for looking out for me. And just something as simple as that acknowledges, okay, I'm not here to shut you up. I'm actually here to acknowledge and thank you because I know all you're trying to do is protect me. A lot of times people try and quiet their mind and shut up their mind and, push away the thoughts. Actually do the opposite. Give thanks for it because the mind's actually just a watchdog looking out for your sense of safety. So that's number one, is working with the mental watchdog, just like you'd work with a puppy that you just adopted that's just barking all the time. But in reality, it thinks it's your guard dog. The second thing is whenever you have looping thoughts or repetitive thoughts or intrusive thoughts or any sort of compulsions, a lot of times we use the mind and we use mental activity as a way of avoiding the body and our feelings. So if you think about thoughts as the language of the mind and feelings as the language of the body, these are complementary opposites. So the more you think, the less you feel. And the more you start to quiet the mind, the more you allow yourself to start feeling again. So if someone is really struggling in their psyche with a lot of these patterns, one thing I recommend is just asking this question, what am I unwilling to feel right now? And then go into your body, drop into your body, and just allow yourself to be present with whatever's rising up in your body, whether it be feelings or sensations. And just be present with the energetic experience of being in your body. And don't try and label or add any stories to it. Because a lot of times what happens is, for example, anxiety, if you drop into your body, what does that feel like? Well, my heart's beating a little faster, my stomach's churning a little bit, a little tingly, a little sweaty in my palms. And we associate that with anxiety, so we're like, oh, that's negative, I don't want to feel that. But then you're going to pick up your girlfriend on your first date, and all of a sudden you feel really excited. And you're like, oh, what does that feel like? Well, my heart's beating a little faster, my stomach's turning, my palms are tingling and sweating a little bit. But that's excitement, so that's positive, so I'm willing to feel that. So a lot of times we polarize our experience of this is negative, this is positive, based on the story and label we've attached to it. But in reality, the experience on a physiological level in your body is exactly the same, whether it's anxiety or excitement. So one thing I tell people is when you're struggling with something and something's coming up, I say drop the story, drop the label, and drop into your body. And just allow yourself to feel the physiological and energetic experience in your body, knowing that the law of impermanence says this too shall pass. If there's a starting point, there's an ending point. So if you allow yourself to feel and you allow the energy and the emotions to move through you naturally and just be in your body, those two steps of the mental watchdog and dropping into your body are really, the first two steps that actually go a long way in kind of moving through those experiences a little, smoother.